Hey everyone! This evening we're diving into a truly captivating topic, the condition of mental health during the medieval period. What did it really feel like to experience anxiety, depression, or just a general sense of imbalance? Well, let's put it this way. Counseling sessions weren't exactly part of the neighborhood association's benefits. So before you settle in, go ahead and hit that like button if you truly appreciate the content here, and consider subscribing. Also, drop a comment letting me know your location and the current time there. It's always intriguing to discover who's watching from different corners of the globe. Now, lower the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle ambient noise, and let's gently embark on this exploration together. Let's begin with the fundamentals. In medieval Europe, aspects like your emotional well-being, your dispositions, your vitality, your inner reflections, and even your inclination to weep over overcooked oatmeal were thought to be governed by a mixture of bodily liquids. These weren't symbolic concepts, they were actual physical secretions. And indeed, it's likely that someone attempted to quantify them at some point. This long-standing framework originated from the Greeks, particularly Hippocrates and Galen, and it persisted far beyond its reasonable lifespan. The concept of the four humors proposed that your overall health, temperament, and emotional state were all regulated by the equilibrium of blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each substance corresponded to a specific character trait. An excess of blood rendered you lively and enthusiastic, though it could become irritating, leading to treatments like leeching to draw it out. Too much yellow bile resulted in irritability and rashness, ideal for combat, but problematic at social gatherings. Black bile linked to melancholy, which aligns with what we recognize today as depression, though in that era it was viewed as an emotional disequilibrium stemming from chilly and arid environments, along with excessive idle contemplation. And phlegm was associated with those who were sluggish, serene, or perhaps simply fatigued. So if sadness struck, you didn't seek out counseling. You required a container and someone equipped with a blade. The standard remedy for psychological turmoil was bloodletting, an entertaining process in which a vein was incised with the hope that it would alleviate your distress before you fainted. If that failed, purgatives might be suggested, since evidently when your spirit ached, the issue lay in your intestines. Healers, and we're applying that term loosely, would assess you through insightful inquiries such as, are you sensing dampness or dryness today? They could inspect your urine, reference celestial bodies, or evaluate your breath. The verdict: invariably the humors. You were deemed overly warm, excessively cool, too moist, too parched, or just too challenging to address without heavenly aid. It's important to note that these weren't marginal opinions. This represented the core of medical practice for hundreds of years. So when envisioning a medieval individual enduring a panic episode, don't imagine a sympathetic companion providing herbal tea. Envision a figure in a garment, armed with a diagram of fluids and a keenly sharpened tool, declaring, "Let's extract the sorrow." In medieval Europe, if you sensed emotional, psychological, or spiritual unease and couldn't attribute it to wrongdoing, evil forces, or your neighbor's peculiar loaf, another evident cause emerged: the moon. That luminous sphere in the night sky was thought to exert a direct effect on your psychological condition. The word lunatic didn't arise randomly. It derives from luna, the Latin term for moon. And individuals truly held the view that excessive moonlight could disrupt your mind like a poorly prepared omelet. This wasn't merely a rural superstition. It was broadly endorsed by physicians, religious leaders, thinkers, and even the fellow shouting by the water source. The notion was that the moon, as a heavenly entity with its own whims, could interfere with your internal fluids, particularly those in the brain, which were imagined to swirl around your cranium like a melancholic broth whenever the full moon aligned perfectly. Those exhibiting odd behavior during a full moon weren't regarded as strained, burdened, or neurologically diverse. They were simply afflicted by lunar influence. Some were even confined briefly until the moon's phase shifted, which served as the era's healthcare equivalent of riding it out. The moon was also faulted for seizures, sleeplessness, visions, and essentially any ailment not readily addressed by broth bloodsuckers or supplication. If you were wandering or sobbing at night, they wouldn't inquire about your early years. They'd question the heavens. Even creatures weren't exempt. Agricultural workers insisted that sheep grew uneasy and canines vocalized differently beneath a full moon. And if your bovine overturned a wagon or your swine dashed into the forest, someone was sure to grumble, "The moon's plotting something." Naturally, no empirical evidence supported this. But to be equitable, empirical methods didn't exist either. Most healing manuscripts referenced astrology as routinely as we mentioned stimulants, and remedies frequently encompassed not only botanicals and dietary adjustments, but also stellar configurations. Because occasionally it wasn't insanity. It was merely unfavorable lunar vibes. If your emotional state deteriorated, perhaps you began sobbing into your meal, yelling at foliage, or conversing in poetic verses. The initial consultant wasn't a healer. It was the nearby cleric. Why? Because during the Middle Ages, the psyche was seen as a religious arena, and any conduct deviating from the standard was promptly viewed through a doctrinal perspective. Depression might indicate you'd transgressed and overlooked it. Anxiety could signal that Satan was settling comfortably within your essence. Auditory hallucinations represented a typical infernal lodging scenario. Clerics essentially functioned as the standard psychological health experts, except rather than sessions, they provided absolution, abstinence from food, and a firm admonition that you were formed from earth and ought to behave accordingly. If you displayed symptoms of what we'd now identify as psychological disorders, the cleric would conduct an ethical evaluation. Were you neglecting worship, desiring your neighbor's spouse, or chuckling excessively? Indeed, that raised suspicions. If affirmative, your ailment might not necessitate botanicals. It could demand atonement. For more severe instances like delusions, silence, or unpredictable actions, the religious institution possessed more substantial methods. These encompassed prayer sessions, journeys to holy sites, and in exceptional circumstances, lesser rites of expulsion. Merely to confirm your melancholy wasn't an imposter fiend. Better safe than sorry. Even ordinary feelings fell under scrutiny. Overabundant delight might be perceived as conceit, profound grief as spiritual laziness, also termed acedia, which was essentially religious melancholy, addressed with hymns and remorse. If you were somber, you didn't require encouragement, you were ethically precarious and perhaps not exerting sufficient effort. The paradox: numerous individuals truly derived solace from the religious explanations. In an era lacking brain science, the concept that affliction carried universal significance was strangely comforting. It imposed order on disorder, even if the remedy leaned heavily on incantations. Nevertheless, if you faced a psychological health challenge in the Middle Ages, your optimal outcome wasn't empathy. It was a cleric with a reasonable demeanor and a minimal inclination toward accusations of possession. So, you've been perceiving voices, experiencing apparitions, or simply engaging too affectionately with your meal. In contemporary society, you might receive counseling or at least a suggestion for a self-care audio series. In the Middle Ages, you received a rite of expulsion. Indeed, the favorite approach for numerous psychological disruptions wasn't pharmaceuticals or repose, but a resolute and dramatic religious ousting. The reasoning was straightforward. If you were behaving unusually, it likely wasn't due to tension or injury. It was Lucifer establishing residence behind your eyes, and he wasn't contributing to expenses. Rites of expulsion came in two forms: the lesser variety, which was essentially a fervent group prayer with sanctified water and murmurs, and the greater variety, which resembled a theatrical production featuring one anxious subject, one elaborately attired cleric, and a supporting ensemble of worried friars chanting in an ancient tongue. The ceremonies differed, but the core elements stayed uniform: reciting scriptural readings, gestures of the cross, sacred objects, and sometimes shouting phrases like, "Be gone, vile entity," straight into your visage. If you recoiled, that was interpreted as proof of efficacy. If you didn't recoil, they simply recited more vigorously. Certain accounts depict tormented individuals being restrained, dusted with salt, or compelled to consume blessed water. Others were required to abstain from food for days prior, which, truthfully, could provoke peculiar conduct in anyone. One ill-fated person allegedly had spirits expelled from his ears via smoldering botanicals like sage and incense, along with what we presume was a profound misapprehension of airflow. And if none of that succeeded, you were either considered irredeemable or sadly misidentified as inherently malevolent. Not all rites of expulsion were horrifying, however. In numerous communities, they served as group occasions where residents assembled in the village center to observe a classic otherworldly confrontation. Consider it medieval devotional drama, part holy ceremony, part amusement, part local rumor initiator. But truthfully, most who endured rites of expulsion weren't wicked. They were merely burdened, scarred, neurologically varied, or unfortunate enough to suffer a panic episode close to a religious authority. Let's suppose you weren't sufficiently disturbed for a rite of expulsion, but still quite unsettling during meals. You cried without cause, occasionally forgot your identity, or lingered too long gazing philosophically at kindling. In such scenarios, your remedy wouldn't include restraints or exclamations, just extensive supplication, possibly while confined to a chamber. This was recognized in certain groups as the compassionate method for addressing psychological health. You'd be informed that your ailment had a devotional root and could be surmounted via introspection, self-control, and, naturally, unyielding contrition. Fundamentally, medieval psychological care reduced to, have you attempted regretting it? The rationale was that anguish refined the essence. So, if you were already enduring psychologically, you were evidently midway there. Friars and sisters, some truly empathetic, others merely perpetually overburdened, might direct you through intervals of contemplative quietude, supplication, overnight watches, abstinence, and resting on unforgiving surfaces until either the adversary departed or you lost recollection of joy. Some individuals willingly joined religious houses as a sort of medieval sanctuary. These weren't exactly resorts. They were more like devotional pause areas. You received a small room, a sacred text, and 8 hours of daily recitation. Sometimes you'd also get a stew. Whether this alleviated psychological disorders or merely concealed them beneath devotional fatigue remains a topic of discussion. And then there were the sacred artifacts. Feeling ill. Touch a saint's bone shard. Struggling with sleep, rest near a container of martyr's blood, sad without explanation? That's the purpose of Saint Euphemia's toe. The belief was that sanctity was transmissible, akin to benevolence or parasites. To be equitable, this approached the nearest form of empathetic care in many regions. Unlike rites of expulsion or floggings, the supplication-centered path typically avoided harm. It involved abundant recitation and being informed your ideas were troublesome. Occasionally, friars truly assisted individuals through fellowship, tranquility, and organized schedules. Other times, they simply advised fasting and anticipating celestial insight by dawn. Let's assume your ailment extended beyond occasional gloom and sporadic candle gazing. Perhaps you'd begun strolling barefoot across the settlement, murmuring about celestial beings or vociferously disputing doctrine with farm creatures. At that stage, the medieval reaction wasn't a mutual aid circle. It was a stone enclosure with a single opening and no handle on your end. Enter the religious cell, or as some scholars politely term it, safeguarded seclusion. These cells were nestled within religious houses or places of worship and were regarded as an act of kindness emphasis on regarded. You wouldn't be shackled or tormented, ideally, but you would be strongly urged not to depart, sometimes for years. The area was basic. Unadorned walls, perhaps a straw bedding, and if fortunate, a small aperture through which nourishment, mainly chilled porridge, would appear twice daily. Interactions with others were infrequent, as the prevailing idea was that your derangement was transmittable, whether sentimentally, devotionally, or environmentally. You weren't completely overlooked, however. Friars might offer supplications for your essence. Occasionally, a benevolent sibling might deliver botanicals or recite hymns outside your entrance in a manner that implied you weren't the most dreadful sight they had encountered that week. Sometimes the secured chamber wasn't within a religious house but in a genuine communal facility, the initial forms of sanctuaries. These weren't widespread until later, but a few operated in medieval Islamic urban centers and by the 13th century in locations like London and Paris. The objective? Provision of refuge, not healing, and definitely not rehabilitation. To give them due credit, the medieval perspective wasn't invariably harsh. Many thought those with psychological afflictions were nearer to the divine, influenced by the Almighty, or treading that delicate boundary between foretelling and odd conduct. But in practical terms, confining someone for their benefit was simpler than determining how to manage them. Families frequently implored religious houses to accept troubled kin, offering contributions in exchange. The alternative was attempting to justify to the community why Uncle Thaddeus was once more exclaiming Latin amid the vegetables. If you were a female in medieval Europe and felt overwhelmed, irritable, or emotional, maybe after your 11th offspring or your 3rd spouse with foul breath congratulations, you were likely labeled with hysteria. Now, labeled carries significant weight here. Hysteria wasn't truly a diagnosis. It was more a comprehensive rationale for, this female is acting in a manner that discomforts males. Weeping excessively? Hysteria? Not weeping sufficiently? Dubious, possibly sorcery. Voicing views, aspirations, or weariness? Undoubtedly a reproductive organ issue. The term originates from the Greek hysteria, signifying uterus. The hypothesis in Prepare Yourself was that a woman's uterus could detach and roam freely throughout the body, causing havoc wherever it traveled. Yes, exactly. A wandering, unattached uterus was blamed for conditions ranging from nervousness to persistent exhaling. Somewhere in your midsection, your uterus was performing circuits and spoiling your day. Indications of hysteria encompassed breathing difficulties, unease, swooning, sentimental eruptions, And to cite one genuine medieval reference, excessive contemplation. Truly a ruinous ailment. Remedies differed. A cleric might suggest abstinence and supplication. A healer might administer botanicals. And in certain instances, somewhat uncomfortable manual intervention was recommended to pacify the uterus, carried out by birth attendants or, in subsequent eras, by early women's health specialists with a troubling absence of oversight. Matrimony was also viewed as a remedy. If a woman was unattached, she required a spouse to stabilize her uterus. If wedded, then clearly she simply needed to conceive once more. In either case, her psychological health was managed with additional responsibilities and reduced repose. And if she persisted in odd behavior, perceiving visions, avoiding domestic tasks, or harboring too many ideas in Latin, matters could intensify. Some females were charged with sorcery because nothing signifies psychological disorder like cultivating botanicals and posing inquiries. But not everything was grim. In some situations, women discovered assistance from religious communities where everyday demands were milder, and sentimental distress was perceived as component of devotional conflict. Some sisters even documented their torment in manners that resonate surprisingly contemporary, excluding the fiendish analogies. Still, if you were a female in the Middle Ages with emotions, your optimal psychological health tactic was straightforward: maintain silence, keep it brief, and absolutely never converse with your feline publicly. In an era when friars recommended abstinence, clerics attributed blame to fiends, and healers vowed by draining your essence through your limb, the genuine champions of medieval psychological health were the botanists, frequently senior women with plots, felines, and remarkably sharp instincts. These knowledgeable females, occasionally referred to as skilled folk, served as the informal, uncertified counselors of their time. They didn't inquire about your humor's condition. They asked when the issue commenced, how your rest was, and if your relative was troubling you once more. Their techniques were uncomplicated: infusions, extracts, and conversation, though the dialogue was frequently masked as guidance on botanicals. You'd sit in a hazy dwelling encircled by suspended flora, and soon you'd be sipping a brew of valerian root and lavender while venting about your neighbor's swine. It resembled counseling, but it also remedied skin blemishes. Botanists addressed melancholy with soothing mixtures. Nervousness was eased with chamomile and lemon balm. If you were profoundly upset, you might receive mugwort, St. John's wort, or in extreme situations, a potent portion of poppy derivative. They labeled it a slumber aid. You'd describe it as unintended temporal displacement. Most of these women lacked formal schooling, but their cures stemmed from inherited wisdom, watchful observation, and what contemporary medicine terms genuinely attending to the individual, which regrettably also rendered them suspicious to others. The religious institution regarded them as hazards. After all, they functioned beyond the devotional framework, didn't cite Holy Writ, and didn't assert every issue arose from transgression. Some communities quietly valued them. Others charged them with sorcery if they became too renowned, too successful, or too assured openly. Nevertheless, they were frequently the sole source of consolation for those enduring what we'd now term melancholy, injury, or simple exhaustion. If you were fortunate, your community's botanist knew how to combine calming flora, ignite a shielding taper, and assure you that no, you weren't hexed. You were merely weary and undervalued. Were their remedies flawless? Certainly not. Occasionally they applied onions to your souls, but in comparison to being confined in a stone chamber or reprimanded by a friar clutching a goat's cranium, the botanist's method was virtually comprehensive opulence. So far, we've discussed supplications, seclusion, and a delightful botanist with credentials from nowhere. But medieval psychological health featured one additional level of remedies, the genuinely inventive ones. The sort that prompted questions about whether the healer was improvising based on visions and cupboard items. Let's start with the deceased owl remedy. Yes, if you were tormented by melancholy or overabundant thoughts, a common treatment was to affix a dead owl to your head. It was thought the owl, emblematic of insight, would soak up the bewilderment or gloom through your scalp. In reality, it primarily attracted insects. Experiencing particular nervousness? Attempt pulverized emeralds. That's correct, gem powder. Healers advised crushing genuine precious stones and applying the glittering residue to your torso or ingesting minute quantities. Not only did it fail, it was an excellent method to impair both your gastrointestinal system and your adornment assortment. Then, there were the cures incorporating astrology, which were less therapeutic and more celestial mood assessment. A patient's psychological disturbance might be attributed to Mars in a foul temper. Remedy: await until Jupiter appeared more amicable. One medieval healing guide proposed enveloping the afflicted in wolf hide during a storm to frighten away the derangement. Another suggested murmuring into the left ear of a dark canine and then permitting it to flee with your grief, like a profoundly sorrowful, very furry counseling messenger. You could also encounter remedies involving fumigated botanicals inserted into pigeons, which were then fluttered near your head. No one is entirely certain what this was intended to achieve, but it was highly fragrant and quite bothersome to the bird. And if none of that succeeded, there was always pilgrimage, the universal medieval answer to all issues. Prepare your footwear, seize a rod, and trek hundreds of miles to a sacred location. With fortune, you'd either attain devotional tranquility or at least acquire sufficient blisters to divert from your sentimental condition. These eccentric cures remind us that medieval healing wasn't entirely spiteful, just profoundly misguided, frequently experimental, and occasionally avian-oriented. And hey, if nothing else, they provided people with optimism, which in those times was about as near to antidepressants as possible. Every medieval settlement, large or small, appeared to have that individual. You know the type clad unusually, muttering to himself, sometimes sanctifying poultry, sometimes denouncing puddles. The town eccentric. And oddly, society didn't always confine him or summon blessed water. They simply allowed him to exist. In a period when psychological health was misunderstood at best and dreaded at worst, this was surprisingly forward-thinking. Individuals with evident psychological disorders weren't always exiled. They were frequently integrated into everyday existence, endured like erratic climate or that one goat who believes it controls the pathway. The eccentric, or eccentric women, were regrettably more prone to sorcery accusations, occupied a unique position in the medieval societal structure. Not quite a danger, not quite a jest, and occasionally venerated. In some settlements, these people were even perceived as influenced by the divine or granted reluctant admiration for their unpredictability. If they uttered enigmatic phrases while gazing at the sun, people presumed it was heavenly prophecy or merely midweek. They were typically assigned a moniker: Old Will the Roamer, Mad Meg, Tom Fool. You'll observe these resemble tavern titles, which reveals much about how much folks imbibed while contemplating derangement. These individuals often resided on the outskirts, slumbering in deserted grinders, church entrances, or actual barrels, Diogenes fashion. Community members would sometimes provide sustenance or footwear or simply a wide berth. Youngsters were instructed not to gawk, which naturally meant they gawked incessantly. Occasionally, their peculiar conduct would prompt minor acts of benevolence. A baker might set aside crusts, a metalworker might mend a warped walking cane. Medieval groups, despite their superstitions, could be remarkably empathetic, particularly when remorse and the dread of everlasting condemnation served as strong incentives. But if the eccentric's actions became too vociferous, too aggressive, or too disturbing, tolerance waned. Then arrived the clerics, the seclusion, or graver measures. Acceptance had boundaries, especially if the afflicted ceased being entertaining and started being inconvenient. In contemporary times, we recognize that depression is a multifaceted condition involving neural chemistry, life situations, and sometimes just awful weekdays. But in the Middle Ages, if you felt persistently down, exhausted, or like existence was a gradual mud avalanche, congratulations, you were culpable of acedia. Acedia wasn't viewed as a psychological health matter. It was categorized as a devotional shortcoming, one of the initial mortal sins before sloth ultimately usurped its prominence and claimed top status. Acedia was sorrow at heavenly goodness, or in more pragmatic terms, devotional indifference, absence of delight, and the general medieval equivalent of reclining in bed, staring at the roof. Friars were particularly susceptible to this condition, which they lyrically dubbed the midday fiend. Imagine it. A friar meant to transcribe hymns, gazing at a wall pondering the purpose of everything. In today's society, that's termed burnout. In the 12th century, it was an ethical dilemma demanding prompt censure and possibly additional devotional beads. Those afflicted with acedia weren't provided consolation. They were instructed to supplicate more intensely, labor more, and cease being egocentric. Depression wasn't an ailment, it was indolence with a label. If your essence lacked joy, it was your responsibility. Perhaps you hadn't atoned sufficiently. Maybe you were covertly arrogant. Maybe. And this was the extreme choice. You were permitting Satan to prevail. And if you ventured to voice your grief aloud, you weren't merely pitied. You were seen as infectious. Melancholy could propagate. It resembled sentimental mold, and religious houses didn't want it permeating the structures. Ordinary folk weren't immune either. If you couldn't derive pleasure from your labor, it wasn't because you were fatigued or mourning. It was an indication that you needed confession and perhaps to construct a shelter from remorse. Ironically, some accounts from friars who combated acedia resonate remarkably contemporary. Depictions of numbness, weariness, agitation, even thoughts of self-harm. But instead of counseling, they recommended abstinence and mentally listing your transgressions alphabetically. In a time when most individuals possessed two garments and one was infested with parasites, you'd assume laughter would be promoted, a bit of happiness, perhaps a giggle to endure the plague-ridden, mud-covered, bloodsucker-filled horror that was daily existence. Think again. In medieval Europe, laughter wasn't always an indicator of contentment. It was frequently considered an ethical warning. Certainly, peasants chuckled, entertainers chuckled. Occasionally, even friars smiled if a bird did something especially outrageous. But the formal position from theologians, chroniclers, and very solemn individuals was that laughter could be perilous, a portal sentiment to disorder, transgression, and possibly rhythmic movement. The religious institution, ever vigilant of human frailty, cautioned against immoderate merriment. Thomas Aquinas, whose wit was reportedly categorized as pending development, held that laughter should be tempered and fulfill a loftier aim. Unrestrained laughter? A marker of devotional disarray, perhaps even infernal sway. After all, who chuckles without motive? Response: individuals with an operational sense of humor. Women, naturally, were judged twice as harshly. A chuckling woman was evidently scheming something sorcery, likely while a grave. Mute woman was suitably devout or simply very parched. And let's not overlook the laughter of the deranged. If someone chuckled at unsuitable moments, say, during a burial or while tending a goat, it wasn't regarded as quirky. It was proof of psychological disorder, possession, or both. Uncontrolled giggling was essentially a warning flag with a rattle. In some devotional orders, initiates were expressly prohibited from laughing during repasts, supplication, or essentially any pursuit that might foster human bonds. Delight was acceptable in concept, but it had to be the inwardly sacred variety, not the belly-laughing beverage-snorting kind you experience after someone tumbles on a root vegetable. Still, people did chuckle. Humor endured in community celebrations, in mocking verse, and in that one fellow in every settlement who produced amusing sounds with his underarms. But it was always somewhat hazardous. Joy was permitted, but not relied upon. In today's society, conversing with your feline is eccentric. In the Middle Ages, it was potentially blasphemous, mildly concerning, and depending on your intonation, grounds for questioning your rationality or arranging a mild rite of expulsion. You see, medieval society had very distinct notions about whom you could and could not engage in dialogue. Humans were acceptable, clerics preferable. But if you began chatting with beasts, unseen celestial beings, or anything that didn't respond audibly, brows were furrowed, usually succeeded by flames. Let's commence with beasts. Felines were already balancing on a precarious edge. On one side, they managed vermin. On the other, they were graceful, enigmatic, and never attended worship. If you shared confidences with your striped companion too frequently, people might presume she was your ally, dispatched by the adversary to murmur prohibited knowledge about botanical cures and where your neighbor concealed his dairy. Birds were also suspect. Medieval animal compendiums were filled with semi-accurate odd facts. If someone claimed a raven foretold the future, that wasn't lyrical. That was betrayal of reason. Even canines, humanity's faithful partners, were tolerable until they started appearing in your dreams, garbed in robes and citing Holy Writ. Then there were the celestial beings, who, according to innumerable devotional texts, were omnipresent, observing, safeguarding, and occasionally conveying foreboding messages during tempests. If you asserted to perceive or hear them frequently, you might be deemed saintly, or, if your timing was unfortunate, deranged or possessed. The distinction often hinged on whether you were in a religious house or exclaiming at clouds in the community center. And of course, imaginary companions. Youngsters mostly received leniency. But adults, if you claimed to converse with unseen entities who provided directives, the possibilities were restricted: seer, lunatic, or prospective pyre ornament. There wasn't much intermediate territory. Interestingly, some visionaries like Hildegard of Bingen asserted vivid apparitions in dialogues with holy figures, and because they were secluded, learned, and somewhat daunting, they were endured. But if you were a rustic named Bertram who discussed doctrine with rodents, you probably weren't authoring ornate manuscripts anytime soon. In the medieval world, psychological disorder balanced between two extremes. Either you were a mobile oddity or a disgraceful family secret, and often both, depending on whether the village bazaar was operating. Let's start with public display. If someone with visible psychological disorder roamed through the settlement muttering, dancing in precipitation, or debating fervently with a container, They might draw notice, not disdain. In fact, they could become a staple of community life, like the chime tower or that one goat that always evaded. People would observe, murmur, perhaps even chuckle, not from malice, well, not invariably, but from a strange mix of entertainment and apprehension, because deep inside, everyone fretted that could be them next week if struck on the head or consuming tainted eel pastry. In some areas, these individuals were known as natural fools, a phrase that sounds offensive but was oddly endearing by medieval measures. They were viewed as innocent, nearly childlike, and sometimes believed to have been touched by the divine, fate, or just a very unlucky lunar phase. You could end up with sustenance, shelter, and a sobriquet. It wasn't perfect, but in a world without counseling, it surpassed being confined in a spire. But for families, it wasn't so enchanting. If your kin was quietly struggling, perhaps melancholic, reclusive, or plagued by what we'd now call nervousness, it was often managed as a private affair, which in medieval terms meant never discuss it. Shame was a potent social commodity, and a troubled mind in the household could cast a poor light on the entire ancestry. Some families concealed afflicted members. Others dispatched them to religious houses or holy journeys, hoping sacred locations would succeed where botanical infusions had failed. In some sadder cases, people were disowned completely, especially if seen as disruptive or, worst of all, embarrassing at nuptials. Public psychological health care scarcely existed. Shame occupied the space where support networks should have been. No facilities, no community assistance, just a blend of hushed supplications and feigning normalcy. By the conclusion of the Middle Ages, around the late 15th century, give or take an epidemic, things began to evolve. Not rapidly, not elegantly, but if you peered closely, you could detect early indications of humanity progressing toward empathy, one perplexed scholar at a time. For one, philosophy and science started infiltrating the discourse. Thanks to Arabic healing texts preserved and translated in places like Spain and Sicily, Western Europe was reacquainted with ancient Greek thinkers who, while not precisely modern psychologists, had at least pondered that the human psyche wasn't merely a fiendish marionette performance. Scholars began to toy with the idea that derangement could arise from bodily imbalances, not just transgressions or enchantment. Physicians started composing treatises on melancholy and mania with fewer scriptural references and more anatomical details. Don't get too thrilled treatment still involved things like attaching a bloodsucker to the temple, but at least people were studying. At the same time, the notion of benevolent care began to develop. In cities like Valencia and Cairo, early hospitals started segregating patients with psychological disturbances from general areas. Some even provided gardens, music, and, astonishingly, conversation. It was still far from respectful, but superior to being reprimanded by a cleric while bound to a goat stake. The printing press didn't hinder either. With greater access to volumes, ideas about the mind began to disseminate faster than infections at a midsummer gathering. This helped sow the seeds for the Renaissance, when psychological illness began its long ascent from "you're hexed" to "you might need assistance." Of course, not everything transformed. People still feared what they didn't comprehend, and the boundary between derangement and mysticism remained as slender as a friar's bedding. But the foundation was established. Gradually, the deranged were no longer viewed solely as containers of transgression or heavenly wrath. They were, in a radical shift, beginning to be seen as human fallible, suffering, and deserving of care. Not embraces, though, that would arrive centuries later. From the exterior, noble existence appeared divine. scented hallways, gem-encrusted garments, attendants fulfilling every desire. Whether at Versailles or within the imperial barriers of Kyoto, nobility projected an image of flawlessness, grace preserved in eternity like a painting. But what the populace didn't witness was the stifling reality beneath the powdered visages and strict protocol. For many nobles, this opulent life was less paradise and more a plush-lined confinement. Every facet of a noble's day from awakening time to napkin folding was governed by unspoken regulations or ceremonial protocols. In France, nobles were required to participate in the lever ceremony each morning, where courtiers would queue to observe the king rise from bed. Participation wasn't elective. If you weren't visible in the appropriate chambers at the proper times, gossip circulated. Your sway diminished, your adversaries grinned, and at Versailles, forfeiting social standing was often more lethal than losing wealth. Across the globe in Japan, court nobles in Kyoto confronted a distinct but equally oppressive script. The high-end elite were expected to excel in verse, script art, melody, and the nuanced craft of detached demeanor. Every utterance, every inclination, every sleeve motion was political performance. And failure to execute correctly? Social demise. Even recreation was staged. A gathering wasn't merely a celebration, it was an evaluation of partnerships. A stroll in the garden might be a mute arena of glances and concealed slights. You weren't simply existing. You were enacting a role in an everlasting drama where the spectators were all and the stakes were your heritage. And yet few nobles fled, because the very advantages that made them envied also bound them. Inheritance statutes, arranged unions, debt commitments, and the perpetual oversight of competitors meant they seldom controlled their own destinies. Behind the sealed doors of their grand residences, many nobles endured psychological decline, silent defiance, or devotional despair. But publicly, they smiled. Always smiled. This was the grand contradiction of noble life. The greater your prestige, the lesser your liberty. They were born at the pinnacle, but often perished without ever living for themselves. When you envision a nobleman striding through Versailles in silk hose, or a lady descending a staircase in pearls, the last thing you picture is bill collectors. But behind all the splendor, a surprising number of nobles were financially sinking. It turns out that upholding the facade of affluence was costlier than genuine affluence itself. At Versailles, appearances were paramount. A noble might expend more on a fresh vest or formal dress than on sustaining an entire property. Why? Because style was capital. If you didn't maintain it, you faded politically, socially, and ultimately economically. Courtiers would wager immense amounts, not only at games of chance, but on equines, property ventures, and high-risk coalitions. Many nobles pledged ancestral lands to finance one additional season of social prominence. And the king didn't assist. Louis XIV especially encouraged lavish expenditures at court to keep them reliant, diverted, and faithful. A destitute noble was a manageable noble. In England, the aristocracy wasn't much improved. During the Georgian period, lords and ladies often resided in lavish urban dwellings in London, financed wholly on loans. Tailors, wine sellers, and hat makers were expected to wait months, sometimes years, for settlement. Entire lineages teetered on the brink of ruin, hoping their daughter would wed a richer man or that some distant relative would pass and bequeath them a title and a functional estate. Meanwhile, in Russia, nobles were awarded vast territories inhabited by serfs, and yet many were still lacking in liquid assets. The wealth was immobile. Extravagant lifestyles in Moscow demanded constant borrowing. pawn establishments discreetly handled crowns and blades. Family treasures were sold by candlelight behind secured doors. Japan's noble class fared no better during eras of tranquility. As the samurai shifted from warrior to administrator during the Tokugawa period, many nobles found themselves ceremonial but insignificant. Allowances dwindled, expenses persisted. Some took supplementary occupations, yes, actual jobs in verse academies or property oversight to uphold appearances. But admitting fiscal hardship was a disgrace, so debts accumulated secretly. The lesson: nobility wasn't about financial security. It was about the enactment of wealth, and often that enactment came at a spirit-crushing price. Scandal was the unofficial secondary tongue of the nobility. Liaisons, gems, concealed offspring, murmured disloyalties. The more refined the public persona, the more sordid the private realities. Nobles possessed authority, prestige, and privilege. But what many lacked? Moderation. In Versailles, courtiers resided in such proximity that privacy was almost non-existent. And yet, forbidden connections thrived. Queen Marie Antoinette was ceaselessly accused of romantic involvements, whether with Swedish nobles or her close female companions. Many of these rumors were untrue, but they persisted because everyone knew someone engaging in precisely that. The court virtually operated on chatter, and scandal wasn't just endured, it was capital. Your name in another's private chamber could either elevate your sway or devastate your lineage. Meanwhile, over in England, aristocratic reputations were torn apart in drawing rooms and wagering dens. Lord Byron, for instance, was rumored to have sired children with his half-sister. That didn't prevent him from being a celebrity, but it cast a long shadow over his noble status. Nobles were expected to have paramours, just not too many, and definitely not the wrong ones. Liaisons with performers, commoners, or foreign agents could lead to banishment, incarceration, or in rare cases, an early demise. In Imperial Russia, the court of Catherine the Great was notorious for its openness. The Empress herself had lovers throughout her rule, often selected and elevated to positions of authority. But it wasn't just Catherine. Her courtiers were constantly involved in schemes, often blending political tactics with intimate pursuits. Affairs were less about affection and more about advantage. Even in the refined high-end court of Japan, where restraint and poetry dominated, scandal infiltrated through haiku and romantic missives. A noblewoman might receive a midnight guest whose identity she would never disclose, but her subsequent poem, shared among the elite, might offer just enough imagery to spark a blaze of conjecture. The most perilous scandals, however, were those that never entered letters or court murmurs, the ones involving disloyalty, spying, and betrayal of kin. These were whispered in passages, recorded in encrypted correspondence, and interred in family records. Because in noble life, scandal wasn't the anomaly. It was the backdrop, beautiful, intricate, and always concealing fissures beneath. For all their worldly authority and luxury, nobles were often tormented by a far less visible force, the oppressive burden of devotional uncertainty. They possessed everything, yet still grappled with existential fear. Being born into privilege didn't grant clarity about the hereafter, ethics, or divine intent. In fact, it often exacerbated matters. In Catholic France, guilt adhered to palace corridors like haze. The same nobles who attended daily worship might also indulge in revelry every evening. Confession was routine, but more for social display than genuine remorse. Still, many nobles, especially in later years, were haunted by their transgressions. Some turned to mystics and seers, desperate for responses. Even Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, grew more pious in his final years, tormented by fear over his earthly excesses and the conflicts he'd initiated. Across Europe, nobles financed religious buildings and religious houses, not just from devotion, but as assurance. In their minds, a new sanctuary might purchase a purer conscience. 1,000 candles ignited in their name could counterbalance a life of schemes and overindulgence. Some withdrew into monastic existence altogether in old age, exchanging plush robes for coarse garments. In Orthodox Russia, matters were more intense. Nobles were expected to uphold both political and devotional order. Yet many wrestled with doubt, especially during the turbulent reigns of czars who proclaimed themselves divinely chosen even as they ordered cleansings. Some nobles sought answers in secret prayer groups or turned to holy wanderers who renounced wealth and comfort to speak uncomfortable truths. These peculiar mystics sometimes served as the only outlet for aristocrats facing spiritual crises. Meanwhile, in feudal Japan, the samurai nobility, a hybrid class, often found themselves torn between Confucian ethics, Shinto rituals, and Buddhist detachment. Some nobles turned to Zen, hoping meditation would quiet their inner turmoil. Others composed poetry not just for art's sake, but as spiritual release. Still, the tension between duty, honor, and life's impermanence gnawed at them. When a noble committed seppuku, it wasn't always about shame. Sometimes it was about spiritual liberation. Despite their silks and titles, nobles were often profoundly lost. Surrounded by ritual and grandeur, many still gazed into the void, wondering if any of it truly mattered. Behind the masks of status, their souls were whispering and sometimes screaming for peace. In the age before smartphones and email, the most dangerous thing a noble could send wasn't an assassin. It was a letter. Ink on parchment could undo a dynasty, expose an affair, or spark a revolution. And nobles, despite their outward elegance, were compulsive correspondents. They wrote everything down: secrets, longings, schemes, prayers, love, lies. These weren't idle pen pal exchanges. They were calculated tools of diplomacy and survival. At Versailles, every noble had a paper trail: love letters to mistresses, pleas to creditors, carefully worded flatteries to the king. And not all of it was legitimate. Couriers carried sealed notes laced with invisible ink or written in code. A wrong phrase in the wrong hands could lead to exile or the scaffold. Some nobles even had personal codes alphabets invented solely for clandestine conversations. The Duke of Orleans, for instance, was known to correspond with suspected radicals during the lead-up to the French Revolution, and his letters were meticulously encrypted. But codes were never foolproof. In one legendary case, a noble's encrypted diary was decoded long after his death, revealing a hidden life of treason and betrayal. In the Habsburg courts, marriage negotiations often played out through veiled language. A letter might begin with discussions of weather and falconry, but hide deeper intentions between the lines. Parents arranged matches through polite deceptions. Lovers begged for elopement under the guise of visiting countryside estates. In Japan's Heian era, poetry served as code. A single wakaju's 31 syllables could convey forbidden love, rejection, or a secret rendezvous. Noble women were particularly skilled at crafting double-meaning verses, often responding in kind within hours. These exchanges were delivered by discreet messengers, sometimes servants, sometimes children, always sworn to silence. During the Renaissance, some noble women ran entire espionage networks through their salons, writing to allies in foreign courts. In Russia, letters smuggled out of the Tsar's inner circle helped fuel uprisings. Nobles trapped in gilded cages turned to correspondence as their only form of rebellion. Paper became weapon, shield, and confession booth all in one. Of course, the riskiest letters were the ones that never arrived, intercepted, burned, buried. Some lay hidden in attics and wall crevices for centuries, their secrets unread, their senders long forgotten. But make no mistake, within those ink-stained lines lived revolutions, heartbreak, and the rawest truths of the noble soul. In noble society, emotion was a luxury no one could afford. Joy, anger, fear, all were carefully measured, rationed, or concealed entirely. A noble's survival depended not just on wealth or title, but on mastering the art of emotional camouflage. To rule at court, one had to perform and never ever flinch. At Versailles, life was a never-ending theater. Nobles rehearsed their smiles, their bows, their silences. A raised eyebrow could signal support or sabotage. Tears were reserved for funerals, and even then, only if the courtly judgment was watching. The goal was simple. Project Elegance. Hide the chaos. Those who failed were branded unstable, hysterical, or worse, unfit. This emotional choreography was learned young. Noble children were taught to speak only when addressed, to display pride without arrogance, and to suppress grief until it could be confided to private journals. Meltdowns were not just embarrassing, they were politically dangerous. A single outburst could be remembered for decades and used as ammunition in future rivalries. In Japan's Heian court, nobles were even more refined in their restraint. Public emotion was seen as vulgar. One's true feelings were shared only through metaphor and poetry, gestures, or carefully chosen silences. A noble woman's sleeve might carry more meaning than her words. A fan opened halfway could signal heartbreak. A single cherry blossom plucked too early, despair. To survive, one had to master subtlety as fluently as language. In England, nobles kept a stiff upper lip. A scandal could be quietly swallowed with brandy but never spoken of. Behind closed doors, journals wept for them, volumes of sorrow and suppressed rage bound in leather and sealed away in desk drawers. Mental illness, grief, shame. All of it was hidden behind ballroom smiles and military posture. Some cracked under the pressure. There are records of nobles who snapped mid-dance or collapsed during ceremonies, later confined to asylums or sent away to recuperate in remote estates. But these were whispered tragedies. The show, after all, had to go on, because in the grand masquerade of nobility, emotions were a liability. Masks weren't just for balls, they were daily attire. And behind every bow, every compliment, every elegant laugh, there was often a storm raging, perfectly concealed behind silk and etiquette. To be born noble was to inherit not just land and titles, but expectations so heavy they could crush the spirit. From the first breath, a noble child was less a person and more a vessel for legacy. Every decision they made was haunted by the demands of their ancestors and the judgment of generations yet unborn. In France, sons of dukes and counts were groomed like racehorses. Their futures were mapped out in ledgers and family trees. Marry this heiress, befriend that prince, don't embarrass the bloodline. Their lives were a continuation of a strategy that had started long before they were born, and often one they had no power to alter. Even the women were pawns on the family chessboard. A duchess's value was often measured by the strength of her dowry and the purity of her lineage. England's aristocracy had similar burdens. Firstborn sons inherited the estate, the debt, the staff, and the responsibility of ensuring the family didn't fall into disgrace or worse, commerce. Those who failed were remembered not for their humanity, but for being the one who lost the manor. Meanwhile, younger sons without land or title were quietly funneled into the church or military with little choice in the matter. In Russia, noble families carried their status like a ticking time bomb. One misstep, one disagreement with the wrong court faction, and everything could be seized. Land, serfs, even the family name could be revoked. Generations of effort wiped away with a signature. Japan's aristocracy was even more rigid. In Heian times, noble families competed for proximity to the emperor. Positions and influence were passed down not through merit, but through lineage. A single disgrace, a failed marriage, an unruly son could undo centuries of prestige. The pressure to conform was immense, and individuality was often sacrificed on the altar of ancestral duty. And what of those who didn't want the title, who didn't want to marry the stranger, rule the estate, or bear the name? Rebellion wasn't just difficult, it was unthinkable. Some tried. Most were crushed by the machinery of tradition. The burden of inheritance wasn't just a financial or political matter. It was psychological, a crown of thorns worn under a golden halo. To be noble meant to be chained to a legacy, whether you wanted it or not. Not all nobles followed the script. Beneath layers of etiquette and centuries of family pressure, some cracked and others resisted. But rebellion among the nobility wasn't always dramatic. There were no peasant uprisings here, no flaming torches, just quiet, subversive acts tucked into corners of palaces, hidden behind locked doors, or disguised as tradition. In Versailles, where conformity reigned supreme, rebellion took on strange forms. Some nobles chose not to attend the king's elaborate mourning ritual, a grave offense that signaled independence. Others dared to wear colors out of fashion or commission portraits that didn't flatter. A few scandalized their families by marrying for love, not alliance. These small gestures in the world of court politics were explosive. In England, some aristocrats defied expectations by turning to art and literature. Lord Byron didn't just write poetry. He lived a life that mocked every expectation of noble restraint, cross-dressing, traveling with lovers, scorning Parliament. His life was a rolling provocation. Less flamboyant nobles simply vanished to the countryside, retreating from London's social obligations. That alone could be interpreted as rebellion, a refusal to play the game. In Russia, quiet dissent took more dangerous forms. Some nobles supported revolutionary ideas under the radar, disguising radical philosophy salons as harmless poetry gatherings. Others helped serfs escape or gave them education's treasonous acts under the Tsar's rule. These weren't loud revolutions, but quiet betrayals of a broken system. Japanese nobles had even subtler means of rebellion: a poorly timed poem, a gift with a hidden insult, refusing to shave one's head in mourning. All of these could be read as rejection of ritual. Some noble women resisted their arranged marriages by falling in love through poetry, subtle yet scandalous. Others withdrew into religious life, not out of piety, but protest. And then there were those who simply disappeared, nobles who faked illness to avoid court, who buried themselves in dusty libraries, pretending to be too engrossed in astronomy or botany to deal with courtly nonsense. Their retreat wasn't weakness, it was defiance. These rebels rarely made history books, but their choices, however quiet, chipped away at the illusion of perfect obedience. Not all nobles followed the rules. Some whispered no. And that, in their world, was louder than any scream. For all the grandeur and posturing, nobility was obsessed with one thing above all: legacy. Not the kind you feel, the kind you can engrave, paint, parade, and pass down. Portraits in oil, family crests etched into marble, vast estates with names longer than some novels. Every ball, battle, and betrothal was part of an unending project to be remembered. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of them weren't. Yes, we remember the monarchs, the kings who launched wars, the queens who lost their heads, but the average noble? Forgotten. Their elaborate rituals, their infighting, their expensive shoes vanished like breath on glass. What remains are fragments, unsigned letters, crumbling estate walls, cryptic mentions in estate ledgers. The grand story of the aristocracy isn't one of eternal glory. It's one of selective survival. In France, the revolution didn't just end lives, it erased entire bloodlines from memory. Portraits were defaced, names were banned. The aristocracy who obsessed over how history would view them were instead swept away by it. Some survived, sure, by changing names, hiding jewels in fireplace bricks, or fleeing to foreign courts. But their legacies were not what they had intended. They became cautionary tales, not immortals. England's nobles fared better legally protected, land-rich, institutionally embedded. Yet even they were not immune to irrelevance. Once buzzing estates now sit in ruin. Dust covers tapestries that once cost fortunes. The great names? Many dissolved through scandal, poor marriages, or just time. A line with no heirs is a legacy with no future. In Japan, the aristocracy was eventually replaced in importance by the military class, the samurai, and shogunate. The elaborate poetry, the court rankings, the ceremonies faded. And though a few families trace their roots to ancient noble houses, the modern world rarely cares. Even the proudest names became museum labels. And what of those who tried to control the narrative, commissioning epic biographies, dictating memoirs, sponsoring churches? They too are subject to history's selective memory. Often the real stories, the shame, the secrets, the compromises, survive only in whispers, footnotes, or hidden letters. In the end, legacy was the ultimate illusion. Nobles lived in service of being remembered, yet were often forgotten entirely. Behind the portraits in palaces lies a quiet truth. Permanence was never real, only the performance was. In the spring of 1900, a curious man in a wide-brimmed hat stood under the sun, staring at scattered stones and half-buried walls. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist, historian, and eccentric dreamer. He had come to Crete not just to excavate ruins, but to chase a ghost, specifically the ghost of a civilization that had haunted Greek legends for centuries. A civilization so old it slipped through the cracks of both history and myth. For years, travelers and locals had spoken of strange artifacts surfacing in the hills south of Heraklion, pottery older than Mycenaean, strange glyphs no one could read, and ruins that didn't quite match any known Greek style. Evans was convinced that these were the traces of a Bronze Age people older than Homer, older than Athens, who had once ruled the Aegean. Then came the moment that changed everything. On a plot of land known as Kefala Hill, Evans and his workers unearthed a massive structure buried beneath centuries of dust and rubble. Walls emerged, not simple huts, but foundations of rooms, staircases, corridors. What they were looking at wasn't a temple or a fortress, but a palace. And not just any palace, one so complex it seemed designed to confuse anyone who walked inside. A labyrinth, perhaps. Evans immediately made the connection. This had to be the palace of Knossos, legendary seat of King Minos, the same Minos who, according to myth, imprisoned the half-man, half-bull Minotaur deep within a maze beneath his home. Whether myth or not, the ruins matched the story. Countless twisting halls, multiple floors, mysterious dead ends. It was a palace that defied logic, as if built to trap not just people, but time itself. He called the people who built it the Minoans, after Minos. No one knew what they had called themselves. Their script, known as Linear A, was still undeciphered. But their art, their architecture, and their reach suggested an empire long forgotten. And so, with trowel in hand and a myth in mind, Evans began to peel back the centuries. What he found would challenge everything people thought they knew about early European civilization and ignite new debates that still haven't settled. The Palace of Knossos is not a palace in the traditional sense. It's a puzzle made of corridors, courts, and chambers that seems to double back on itself with every turn. Covering more than 150,000 square feet, the structure was a multi-story marvel of the ancient world. And at its heart lay a paradox. How could something so open, so light-filled and advanced, feel so impossible to map? There were no grand walls or moats, no militaristic towers. Instead, Knossos had balconies, skylights, and air shafts, architectural features unheard of in Bronze Age Europe. The entire complex seemed designed not for war, but for ceremony, administration, and perhaps mystery. Stairs wound in dizzying spirals. Narrow corridors opened into sudden courtyards, rooms connected unexpectedly. Scholars have debated for over a century whether this design was intentional, a symbolic nod to the myth of the labyrinth, or simply the result of centuries of rebuilding. To walk through Knossos is to surrender any sense of direction. There are rooms within rooms, wings that loop into each other, and passageways that lead nowhere at all. Evans was convinced this layout reflected the story of Daedalus, the legendary craftsman who constructed the labyrinth for King Minos to imprison the Minotaur. While there's no archaeological proof of a literal monster, the confusion felt while navigating the site is very real. And yet, the palace wasn't just a maze. It was a miracle of ancient engineering. The complex featured advanced plumbing, including terracotta pipes, flushing toilets, and a drainage system so efficient it would make parts of 19th century Europe blush. Rooms had natural ventilation. Light wells illuminated the inner chambers. Some staircases plunged down 3 or 4 stories, suggesting a deep-tiered structure rarely seen before the modern era. The throne room, modest by royal standards, lies tucked deep inside, almost hidden. Its centerpiece is a stone chair flanked by griffin frescoes surrounded by benches. This wasn't a place of spectacle, but of controlled ritual. Perhaps here, power was less about dominance and more about illusion, mysticism, or religious awe. Knossos wasn't built to intimidate. It was built to mystify. Whether you were a trader, priestess, or foreign envoy, one truth was certain. Once you entered, the palace swallowed you whole and made you forget the path you came from. Though the stone walls of Knossos are crumbling, its colors still speak. Buried beneath volcanic ash and time, the palace's frescoes emerged as some of the most vivid, enigmatic, and advanced artworks of the ancient world. Unlike the rigid militaristic art of later Greek or Egyptian civilizations, the Minoan frescoes burst with movement, dancers, dolphins, bulls, and goddesses. They didn't just decorate rooms, they told stories, hinted at rituals, and revealed a civilization that seemed to love life, beauty, and rhythm. One of the most iconic images from Knossos is the bull-leaping fresco, a young figure somersaulting over a massive bull in an elegant, impossible arc. Was this real? Was it myth? Historians have debated it for over a century. Was it a ritualistic sport, a religious offering, or simply a metaphor for taming chaos? Regardless of its meaning, the image captures something essential about Minoan life: a dance with danger, with grace at its core. Elsewhere, the walls bloom with lilies and crocuses, monkeys and birds, spirals and waves. In the Prince of the Lilies fresco, a slender youth with flowing hair and an ornate crown struts with ceremonial confidence. Though Evans initially identified him as a prince, modern scholars aren't sure. The figure may represent a priest or even a goddess. Gender in Minoan art is fluid, symbolic, and still deeply mysterious. Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Minoans didn't focus their art on kings, wars, or conquests. There are no depictions of battles or slaves. Instead, there are scenes of celebration, of nature, of sacred rites. Women are central not in the background, but front and center. Bare-breasted priestesses with elaborate skirts and coiled hairstyles perform rituals, suggesting that women may have held significant, even dominant religious roles. And the colors, deep reds, blues, and whites, still cling to the plaster after thousands of years, defying time. The vibrancy of the artwork hints at a society that not only valued aesthetics, but understood their emotional power. These weren't just pretty paintings. They were symbols of cosmic order, human joy, and spiritual reverence. In the Palace of Knossos, the walls didn't just see history, they sang it. In pigment and pattern, the Minoans painted a world of motion, mystery, and meaning. Among the many enigmas of Knossos, one stands out above all: the prominence of women. Unlike many contemporary societies where women were confined to the margins, the Minoans placed them at the center, literally and symbolically. Their images dominate frescoes, figurines, and ceremonial scenes, hinting at a civilization where female power wasn't hidden. It was celebrated. In the central court and sacred chambers of Knossos, depictions of bare-breasted women in flounced skirts and ornate headdresses appear again and again. These weren't submissive figures tucked behind kings. They were front and center, arms raised in blessing, holding serpents surrounded by symbols of fertility, animals, and divine energy. Scholars believe many of these women were priestesses, intermediaries between the mortal and divine, responsible for overseeing rituals that touched every aspect of Minoan life. One of the most famous artifacts from the palace is the snake goddess figurine. A woman with a piercing gaze, holding serpents in both hands with a feline perched on her head. Was she a deity? A high priestess? A representation of female sovereignty? We may never know, but her image tells us volumes about the spiritual hierarchy of Knossos and who may have stood at its peak. In contrast to the pharaohs of Egypt or the kings of Mycenae, no clear Minoan male ruler has ever been identified in the art. No grand statue of a king, no battle scenes glorifying a warlord. It's led many scholars to suggest that Minoan society may have been matriarchal or at least unusually egalitarian for its time. Women likely held power in both religion and possibly governance, guiding seasonal festivals, managing temples, and performing state rituals. Even the architecture reflects this balance. Rooms believed to be used by high-ranking women with direct access to shrines, light wells, and private staircases suggest they moved freely through the palace. Some frescoes depict women gathering in ceremonial processions, dressed in vivid garments, their posture commanding, not deferential. In Knossos, femininity wasn't confined, it was divine. Whether as priestesses, leaders, or symbols of renewal, women weren't secondary to Minoan culture. They were the culture, its voice, its vision, and possibly its soul. Knossos was not just a royal residence, it was a stage for the sacred. Every corridor, courtyard, and chamber seemed to pulse with spiritual intent. From underground crypts to sun-drenched altars, the palace was built not merely for living, but for communing with the divine. And while no Minoan holy book survives, the architecture itself whispers of rituals that shaped their world. The palace featured dozens of small shrines and ritual rooms, many of them tucked into secluded corners or carved deep below the ground. These weren't places for mass worship. They were intimate, mysterious, and likely restricted to the priestess elite. One chamber, often called the lustral basin, features a sunken tub-like structure at the base of a narrow staircase, not meant for bathing, but likely for purification rites. Perhaps initiates descended in silence, cleansed by symbolic waters before entering sacred ceremonies. The central court, vast and open to the sky, was likely the heart of public ritual. Here, hundreds might have gathered for seasonal festivals, celebrating fertility, renewal, or the turning of the year. The rhythmic sound of drums, the twirl of dancers, the chants of priestesses. Knossos was alive with ceremony, and always present in these rites was the bull, that powerful symbol of energy, virility, and the natural world. Throughout the palace, bull horns, stylized and massive, were placed atop walls and entrances. These horns of consecration, as Evans called them, marked sacred thresholds. Paired with the bull-leaping imagery found in frescoes, it's clear that this animal held deep religious meaning. Some believe a live bull may have even been part of certain rituals, not in brutal sacrifice, but as a partner in a spiritual performance meant to mirror the eternal dance of chaos and order. The double axe, or labris, was another symbol often associated with sacred spaces in Knossos. Found carved into pillars and walls, it may have been a tool, a weapon, or a divine emblem. Its frequent pairing with female figures further supports the idea of a goddess-centered religion. No temples in the traditional sense exist at Knossos. Instead, the palace itself was the temple, every stairwell a procession, every chamber a chapel. It was a place where the spiritual and political were one, and where sacredness was woven into the very walls. Amid the frescoes, altars, and labyrinthine chambers of Knossos, archaeologists uncovered something even more puzzling: writing. Hundreds of clay tablets inscribed with symbols that no one to this day can fully understand. This was Linear A, the script of the Minoans, and one of the last great undeciphered writing systems of the ancient world. Discovered during Evans's excavations, Linear A looked superficially similar to another script found in Mycenaean Greece, known as Linear B. Evans assumed they were related, and they were. But while Linear B was later cracked and revealed to be an early form of Greek, Linear A stubbornly refused to give up its secrets. It's a language unrelated to Greek and possibly unrelated to any known language on Earth. We can read its characters phonetically, but we don't know what they mean. Most Linear A tablets found at Knossos are administrative, inventories of grain, oil, livestock, or offerings. But without knowing the language, the context remains elusive. Were these taxes, ritual offerings, market records? No one can say with certainty. The Minoans wrote for over 500 years, and yet we still can't understand a single full sentence. This linguistic blackout gives Knossos its dreamlike quality. It's like listening to music through a wall. You can sense the rhythm, the energy, the intent, but the lyrics are forever muffled. We can see their rituals in art, their architecture in stone, but their thoughts remain sealed. Linear A was written with a stylus on soft clay, then baked by accident preserved only because the palace was destroyed by fire. Without that disaster, their words might have dissolved long ago. Ironically, the burning of Knossos gifted us with the only surviving fragments of Minoan language. Some scholars believe Linear A might one day be deciphered, especially if bilingual texts are found, much like how the Rosetta Stone cracked Egyptian hieroglyphs. Until then, we're left with isolated symbols: a man, a bull, a jar, a sun, meaningless and yet hauntingly familiar. Gnosos, for all its color and complexity, speaks to us in silence. Its language sits just beyond reach, reminding us that some of history's greatest voices still wait to be heard, buried not in earth, but in mystery. The Palace of Knossos, once a beacon of art, architecture, and ritual, did not vanish in a single cataclysm. Its fall was not swift but layered, a slow unraveling of a civilization whose power once seemed eternal. And like so many ancient collapses, the truth behind Knossos's downfall is a tapestry of fire, water, and whispers of war. Around 1450 BCE, something changed. Suddenly, across Crete, Minoan palaces and towns began to burn. Knossos, curiously, did not fall immediately. Instead, it was reoccupied. But the frescoes changed. The writing on the clay tablets shifted from Linear A to Linear B, not Minoan, but Mycenaean Greek. This suggests that the Mycenaeans, the rising power from the mainland, had either invaded or taken control peacefully after a catastrophe weakened the Minoans. Whatever the method, Knossos was no longer ruled by its native people. One theory points to the eruption of Thera, a volcanic explosion on the island of Santorini, just north of Crete, around 1600 BCE. This cataclysm was one of the most powerful in recorded history, devastating the region with earthquakes and tsunamis. The resulting chaos may have crippled the Minoan economy, wrecked their ports, and weakened their influence, leaving them vulnerable to invasion or internal collapse. Others argue for a gradual economic and political decline. As trade routes shifted and rivals grew stronger, the centralized power of Knossos may have fractured. The palace, once buzzing with activity, became more administrative, more subdued. Ritual gave way to record-keeping. Art gave way to imitation. By 1375 BCE, the palace was abandoned entirely. Fires raged through its halls, roofs collapsed, walls cracked and buckled. Knossos was left in silence, its colors fading, its language unread, its rituals forgotten. And yet, it was never truly lost. Legends of the labyrinth and the Minotaur survived in Greek myth. Hints of Minoan influence echoed through Mycenaean palaces and later in classical art and architecture. The soul of Knossos lingered like smoke, invisible but present. Today, its ruins are open to the sun again. Tourists walk where priestesses once danced, and the palace that once held a civilization together now holds its secrets in plain sight, majestic, mysterious, and unfinished. When Sir Arthur Evans uncovered Knossos in 1900, he didn't just excavate it, he reimagined it with a mix of scholarly ambition and artistic vision. Evans set out not only to preserve the ruins, but to bring them to life. He believed that simply exposing the foundations wasn't enough. The world needed to see the palace as he believed it once was, colorful, complex, and awe-inspiring. What followed was one of the most controversial restorations in archaeological history. Using concrete, a material completely alien to the Bronze Age, Evans rebuilt sections of the palace with modern methods. He employed artists to repaint frescoes using fragments found on site, but often filled in missing details based on assumption, not evidence. Balconies were reconstructed, Columns were restored, not in dull stone, but painted red with black caps, based on Evans's vision of Minoan aesthetics. Rooms were roofed, walls were replastered, and the ancient palace slowly became a hybrid, part ruin, part Edwardian fantasy. Some applauded his boldness. Without Evans, they argued, Knossos might have remained just another tangle of unremarkable ruins. His reconstructions made the site accessible, educational, and emotionally compelling. Visitors could walk through halls that felt alive, see murals bursting with color, and visualize the world of the Minoans with more clarity than ever before. But others saw it differently. Critics accused Evans of overstepping, of imposing his own interpretation on a civilization we still barely understand. The frescoes, for instance, were sometimes almost entirely invented, based on small shards of original paint. Whole sections of the palace, such as the famous throne room, may have been assigned functions they never had. By shaping the ruins to match myth, Evans may have blurred the line between archaeology and storytelling. Today, Knossos is both a marvel and a monument to the complexities of historical reconstruction. Evans's vision cannot be separated from the site. His concrete structures still stand. His artistic interpretations still color the walls. But visitors walk through Knossos with a dual awareness of what the Minoans might have built and what a passionate archaeologist believed they did. In trying to bring Knossos back to life, Evans may have given us two palaces, one ancient, buried in the earth, and one imagined standing boldly above it. Today, the Palace of Knossos stands not only as a ruin, but as a bridge between myth and history, imagination and evidence, Europe and the ancient world. Long after its last ritual was performed and its halls fell silent, Knossos continues to fascinate, mystify, and provoke. Its very existence challenges our assumptions about early civilization and forces us to confront how little we still know. The palace helped redefine the timeline of European history. Before its discovery, most scholars believed that advanced civilization began with the Greeks. Knossos rewrote that narrative. Here was a culture flourishing 1,000 years earlier, with plumbing, urban planning, international trade, and symbolic art. The Minoans, centered at Knossos, were not primitive. They were sophisticated, expressive, and deeply spiritual. But Knossos' legacy is inseparable from its mythology. For millennia, the story of the Minotaur and the labyrinth was dismissed as fiction, a fable to frighten or entertain. And yet, when archaeologists unearthed a palace with hundreds of rooms, corridors that looped and twisted, and symbols of bulls carved into stone, the line between myth and history blurred. Perhaps the legend was not invented but remembered, filtered through generations until only fragments survived. In modern times, Knossos has inspired not just scholars, but writers, artists, and architects. Its double axes, horned symbols, and sinuous frescoes have appeared in fashion, sculpture, and even science fiction. The idea of a hidden ancient civilization beneath the Mediterranean still fuels imaginations, a vision of a time when power didn't mean pyramids or conquest, but beauty, ritual, and balance. Yet Knossos also reminds us of fragility. The palace fell. Its language was lost, its people vanished, and its meaning, its real, original purpose, is still debated. Every interpretation is a mirror, reflecting not just the past, but what we want to believe about it. Walk its halls today, and you stand where priestesses once prayed, dancers once twirled, and children once laughed. You stand at the heart of the oldest palace in Europe, a place that lived between sunlight and shadow, between architecture and myth. Knossos may never give up all its secrets, but in its silence it still speaks of mystery, memory, and the deep labyrinthine path of civilization itself. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born on December 15th, 37th, CE, a child of privilege, but also of poison. His lineage was imperial, tangled in the Julio-Claudian dynasty that ruled Rome with both splendor and suspicion. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was the sister of Emperor Caligula, great-granddaughter of Augustus, and one of the most cunning political players of her time. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was known for arrogance and cruelty. It was said that when someone congratulated him on the birth of his son, he muttered, "Nothing could be born from me and Agrippina but something monstrous." Whether that was a prophecy or just bitterness, time would tell. At just 2 years old, Nero lost his father to dropsy, or possibly to poison. In a Rome where alliances were fatal and ambition was a blood sport, Agrippina now found herself a widow with a child and no real power. But she was patient. She watched as her brother Caligula spiraled into tyranny and was murdered by his own guards. She kept quiet as Claudius, the stammering, bookish uncle, was lifted to the purple robe. Then she made her move. By 49 CE, Agrippina seduced Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, and married him. She wasn't subtle about her goals. Within a year, she convinced him to adopt her son as heir, passing over his own biological son, Britannicus. Lucius became Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, a name fit for emperors. She arranged his engagement to Claudius's daughter Octavia and hired Rome's finest tutors to mold him. Chief among them was the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who tried to shape the young man into a noble ruler. From the outside, Nero was being groomed for greatness. Educated in rhetoric, poetry, philosophy, and music, he learned how to command a crowd, recite Homer, and manipulate public opinion. But Agrippina still held the reins. She appeared beside him in ceremonies, ordered his household, and made it clear who truly wielded power. Nero's rise wasn't born from destiny. It was engineered by a mother who saw herself as empress long before her son ever wore a crown. And within that gilded nursery of ambition and manipulation, the seeds of a chaotic reign were quietly planted. In 54 CE, at just 16 years old, Nero became emperor of Rome. Claudius, his adoptive father, had died officially of illness, though many suspected poison, and the prime suspect, Agrippina. She had long grown impatient with waiting, and when Claudius began reconsidering his biological son Britannicus as heir, she acted. Mushrooms, legend said, were the delivery method, the food of the gods, some joked darkly, and perhaps the food of murder. With Claudius dead, Nero was rushed into power. The Roman Senate approved, the Praetorian Guard applauded, and Agrippina stood triumphantly behind him, dressed in gold and flanked by guards, the real architect of the regime. But she hadn't raised an emperor. She had built a puppet. In the early months of Nero's reign, Rome prospered. He gave generous bonuses to the soldiers, held public games, and promised a return to Augustan values. Behind the scenes, governance was handled by two key figures, Seneca, the philosopher tutor turned speechwriter, and Burrus, the pragmatic head of the Praetorian Guard. Together, they steered Nero through complex decisions while maintaining a veneer of noble restraint. But Agrippina wasn't content to stay in the wings. She expected to rule beside her son. And when Nero began asserting his independence, tensions exploded. At first, the battles were subtle. She demanded to appear on coins beside Nero's image, something no Roman mother had ever done. She intruded on state meetings. She walked into the Senate chamber uninvited. She reminded Nero constantly who had made him emperor. The young emperor chafed under her control. He began to surround himself with his own advisors, men of pleasure and art, not duty. He fell in love with Acte, a former slave girl, much to Agrippina's horror. She had plans for a royal marriage, not romance with a commoner. The once close bond between mother and son began to sour. Whispers spread through the palace of shouting matches, slammed doors, veiled threats. Agrippina, once revered as the empress maker, now seemed a looming threat. Rome had given Nero a throne, but Agrippina still held the leash, and Nero was beginning to reach for the knife. His reign had begun with promise, poetry, and applause. But behind the curtain, a family tragedy was already brewing, one that would stain the imperial purple with blood. By 59 CE, the imperial palace had turned into a battlefield, not of armies, but of wills. Nero was emperor in name, but his mother Agrippina still loomed like a storm cloud over every decision. She undermined his authority, opposed his personal life, and plotted in the shadows to replace him with Britannicus, the late Claudius's biological son. Nero, once the obedient boy with a lyre, had become a young man desperate to escape her grasp. He acted first. Britannicus, a legitimate threat to Nero's throne, suddenly died during a banquet. Guests claimed he choked on his wine, but the poison was so fast-acting, his death was unmistakable. Nero denied involvement. Few believed him. Agrippina certainly didn't. With Britannicus gone, Nero's next problem was his mother. She had once ruled through him. Now he saw her as a rival. Agrippina wasn't just politically ambitious. She was relentless. She met with senators in secret. She paraded noblemen she hoped to position as replacements. She made veiled threats about the Praetorian Guard's loyalties. And, worst of all, for Nero, the people still loved her. Rome admired strong women when they weren't too strong. Agrippina had crossed that line. Nero first tried exile. He stripped her of her bodyguards, removed her from public appearances, and sent her to live in a coastal villa. But distance didn't silence her. She still corresponded, still whispered, still pulled strings. So Nero made a darker choice. He invited Agrippina to a grand celebration, gifting her a lavish boat for her return voyage. That vessel had been rigged to collapse mid-sea. When the sabotaged ship broke apart, Agrippina survived, swimming to shore under moonlight. The botched attempt enraged and humiliated Nero. So he tried again, this time sending assassins to her villa under the pretense of an urgent message. Accounts vary, but one story says she faced her killers calmly, telling them to strike her in the womb, the place that had given birth to Nero. Her murder sent shockwaves through the empire. Nero's guilt was immediate and consuming. He couldn't sleep. He paced at night. He saw her ghost in the halls. Rome, too, whispered of the unthinkable crime, the emperor who had killed his mother. With Agrippina's death, Nero had finally broken free. But in doing so, he also severed the last tether to restraint. What followed would be a reign untethered by shame and spiraling toward infamy. With Agrippina gone, Nero was finally emperor in full. No more whispers, no more maternal oversight, just unfiltered power. But instead of channeling that power into military conquest or administrative reform, Nero turned inward. He didn't want to be remembered as a ruler. He wanted to be adored as an artist. He fancied himself a poet, a singer, an actor. He performed publicly, something no Roman emperor had dared to do. To the Senate and aristocracy, it was mortifying. In Roman tradition, the stage was reserved for slaves and foreigners. But Nero was undeterred. He trained in music and drama, demanded applause, and filled amphitheaters with forcibly enthusiastic audiences. The emperor didn't just host games, he starred in them. Nero composed verses, sang tragic arias, and recited long epics of his own creation. He prided himself on his voice, even undergoing strange treatments to preserve it, including vomiting rituals, long periods of silence, and bizarre diets. Senators sat through hours-long performances, terrified to leave their seats. Not clapping could mean exile or worse. He also threw resources into building theaters, sponsoring athletic contests, and redesigning Rome to reflect his aesthetic tastes. He introduced Greek-style games like the Neronia, a blend of Olympic sports and theatrical competitions, where, unsurprisingly, Nero always won first prize. His obsession with performance spilled into foreign policy. On a trip to Greece, Nero insisted on competing in every artistic contest. At the Olympic Games, he took part in a chariot race with 10 horses instead of the standard 4. He fell off his chariot mid-race, but was still declared the victor. Why? Because he would have won had he not fallen a triumph in Nero's eyes. Yet, even as he indulged in these creative fantasies, the empire groaned. Administrators were neglected. Governors acted without oversight. The provinces grew restless. But Nero didn't care. He wasn't trying to be another Augustus or Tiberius. He wanted to be Orpheus, Apollo, or maybe something even greater, a god of music with absolute power. To the Roman elite, he was becoming a national embarrassment, but to the masses given bread, games, and endless entertainment, Nero was a living spectacle, a flawed god on stage, singing over the cracks in his collapsing empire. In July of 64 CE, a fire ignited near the Circus Maximus. Within hours, flames surged through the city like a divine curse. The streets of Rome, narrow, overcrowded, flammable, became a furnace. For 6 days and 7 nights, the capital of the empire burned. By the end, 10 of the city's 14 districts were reduced to rubble. Thousands were homeless. Temples, homes, marketplaces, gone. And where was the emperor? Rumors flew. Some claimed Nero had watched the blaze from a tower, strumming his lyre and singing of Troy's destruction. Others swore he had ordered the fire himself to make room for a new palace. Nero denied both, and in truth, he wasn't even in Rome when the fire began. But when he returned, he acted with theatrical flair, opening his private gardens to refugees, organizing emergency food deliveries, and funding reconstruction. Yet the whispers persisted. People needed a scapegoat, and Nero, ever the dramatist, gave them one. He blamed the Christians. They were already mistrusted, a strange sect of Jews who worshipped a crucified man and refused to honor the Roman gods. Nero accused them of arson and began a persecution so brutal it would echo through the centuries. Christians were torn apart by dogs, crucified, and most horrifyingly burned alive to serve as torches for Nero's garden parties. It wasn't justice, it was theater by firelight. Meanwhile, Nero unveiled his true ambition, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. On the ashes of central Rome, he began constructing a pleasure palace of unimaginable extravagance with artificial lakes, gilded walls, revolving dining rooms, and ceilings that sprinkled perfume. It was a monument to indulgence. A colossal statue of himself, the Colossus of Nero, was planned to tower over it all. To many Romans, this confirmed their suspicions. Nero hadn't just let the city burn. He had used the fire as a blank canvas. He had erased old Rome to paint a new one, starring himself. But Nero saw it differently. In his mind, he wasn't destroying, he was creating. He was remaking Rome in his image, dramatic, divine and unforgettable. In trying to immortalize himself through art and architecture, Nero scorched the earth and lit the fuse of his own downfall. As Nero's reign dragged on, the applause began to fade, and the fear took its place. The emperor, who once danced across the stage, now paced palace corridors in a state of growing paranoia. He saw enemies in every shadow, conspiracies in every whisper. The artist emperor had become a tyrant in a mask of grease paint. Following the fire and the unpopular construction of his golden house, Nero's standing with the Senate deteriorated rapidly. The aristocracy, already offended by his performances and extravagance, now feared for their lives. In 65 CE, a plot was uncovered, the Pisonian conspiracy, in which dozens of senators, equestrians, and even soldiers were implicated in a scheme to overthrow him. Some wanted to restore the Republic. Others simply wanted anyone but Nero. Nero's response was swift and ruthless. The poet Lucan, the philosopher Seneca, and the general Faenius Rufus were all ordered to commit suicide. Seneca, Nero's former tutor and once his moral compass, was forced to slit his wrists while calmly discussing Stoic philosophy. Even those only rumored to be sympathetic to the plot were swept up in the purges. The palace became a house of executions. The Senate chamber, a silent theater of obedience. The emperor's paranoia deepened. He accused his own wife, Octavia, of infidelity, a charge so flimsy it insulted the intelligence of even his closest allies. She was exiled, then executed. Her head was sent to his mistress, Poppaea Sabina, as a twisted token of affection. But even Poppaea wasn't safe. During a rage or possibly a drunken argument, Nero kicked her in the stomach while she was pregnant. She died soon after. Some say he wept for days. Others claim he mourned the loss of his muse, not the woman. Poison became a regular tool in his arsenal. He relied on the infamous poisoner Locusta All-Woman, whose concoctions had killed emperors and rivals alike. At Nero's command, she trained others, creating a small macabre academy of assassination. By now, Nero's court resembled a stage soaked in blood. Every friend was a suspect, every ally a potential betrayer. And through it all, Nero continued to sing, perform, and believe that he was loved. But the audience was shrinking, the laughter was nervous, and the knives were getting closer. While Nero indulged in performances and purges in Rome, the empire beyond the capital began to rumble. The provinces along the backbone of Rome's power grew restless under the weight of neglect, extortion, and Nero's increasingly erratic rule. Taxes were high, governors were corrupt, and military prestige had eroded. In distant corners of the empire, patience wore thin and rebellion stirred. The first crack came from the east. In 66 CE, the province of Judea erupted into full revolt. Tensions between Roman authorities and the Jewish population had simmered for years, fueled by religious oppression and heavy taxation. When Nero's appointed governors desecrated sacred temples and looted treasuries, open war broke out. The First Jewish-Roman War began, and it would cost Rome dearly. Nero dispatched one of his most competent generals, Vespasian, to crush the rebellion. Ironically, this act would later prove fatal to Nero's own reign. Meanwhile, in the west, the storm clouds gathered darker still. In Gaul and Spain, Roman legions began murmuring discontent. Nero's lavish lifestyle, the destruction of Rome, and his cruelty had eroded the loyalty of both aristocrats and soldiers. Governors like Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul declared open rebellion in 68 CE, accusing Nero of being a disgrace to Rome, a self-absorbed performer unworthy of the purple. Vindex's rebellion failed militarily but succeeded politically. It emboldened others. Servius Sulpicius Galba, the powerful governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, refused to recognize Nero's authority and declared himself a legate of the Senate and people of Rome. It was the first open call for regime change. Back in Rome, panic took hold. Nero's supporters began to flee or turn against him. The Senate, sensing the shift in power, grew bolder. The Praetorian Guard, once his fiercest protectors, was now bribed by Galba's agents. Their loyalty, like everything else in Nero's court, was transactional. Nero tried to rally support. He wept, begged, even considered fleeing to the eastern provinces and returning as a popular artist. But it was too late. The empire had turned against its self-declared god performer. Nero's isolation was complete. The provinces that had once cheered his rise now lit the fuse of his destruction. The emperor had lost his stage, and now the curtain was falling. By June of 68 CE, Nero was emperor in name only. The Senate had turned. The Praetorian Guard. Once the iron wall around his throne had declared allegiance to Galba, the people of Rome. Once entertained by his games and theatrics, now watched in silence as the city held its breath. The empire that Nero had once tried to turn into a stage had now left him without an audience. When Nero awoke on June 9th, messengers brought news that sealed his fate. The Senate had declared him a public enemy. He was to be arrested and executed by the traditional Roman method, the poena culae, or being beaten to death while naked, his head clamped in a forked stick. The same man who once performed to adoring crowds would now die humiliated and alone. Panicked, Nero fled Rome in disguise, dressed in rags and accompanied by a few loyal freedmen. They took refuge in the villa of his former secretary, located in the countryside outside the city. There, in a dark, overgrown garden, the last Julio Claudian emperor hid in a ditch, listening for the sound of approaching horsemen. Even in his final hours, Nero's obsession with legacy did not fade. When he heard hoofbeats in the distance, he reportedly cried out, "What an artist dies in me!" It was not Rome he mourned, but himself, his talent, his image, his tragic ending. His companions urged him to die by his own hand, but he hesitated. For all his brutality, Nero was a coward when it came to death. Finally, as soldiers drew near, he pressed a dagger to his throat with the help of a freedman named Epaphroditus. The blade pierced flesh. He did not die immediately. As blood filled his lungs, he whispered, "Too late. This is fidelity." He was 30 years old. The soldiers found his dying body. Astonished, the Senate now under Galba ordered his burial in a simple grave. No state funeral, no divine honors, just a quiet end to a chaotic reign. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the line of Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius, was extinguished. What followed was a new storm, civil war, chaos, and the rapid rise and fall of emperors. But one thing was clear. Rome would never forget Nero. Nero's body was barely cold before legends began to bloom. Some Romans rejoiced, others mourned, and still more whispered that he wasn't really dead, that he had escaped to the east and would one day return. Over the next few decades, no fewer than 3 impostors claimed to be the resurrected Nero, appearing in Asia Minor with lyres in hand and songs on their lips. The myth of Nero, it seemed, had only just begun. For many in the Roman elite, his legacy was clear. Nero was a monster, a megalomaniac who murdered his own mother, burned his capital, and disgraced the empire with his narcissistic performances. The historians who chronicled his life, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, painted him as a cautionary tale, the artist emperor who let vanity devour virtue. And yet, not everyone agreed. Among the lower classes, Nero remained oddly beloved. He had reduced taxes, built public baths, and organized massive games and grain distributions. He gave Rome its greatest spectacles. Some even considered him a populist vulgar, yes, but generous. Centuries later, Christian texts would demonize him further, with early writers labeling Nero the first Antichrist and possibly the beast of Revelation. He was remembered not just as a bad ruler, but as a cosmic villain. Still, there was something magnetic about Nero's story. He was not the calculating tyrant that Tiberius or Caligula had been. He was theatrical, flamboyant, impulsive, often absurd. He ruled like a man in a permanent dream, casting himself as poet, god, and tragic hero all at once. Even his death felt like a scene from a lost Greek tragedy. In later centuries, artists, playwrights, and filmmakers would resurrect Nero as a symbol of fallen grandeur, a ruler too obsessed with beauty to bear the ugliness of power. His name became shorthand for excess and decline, a lesson in what happens when ego eclipses empire. But perhaps Nero's strangest legacy is this: he made power performative. He understood centuries before mass media that image could be as strong as policy, that if you controlled the narrative, you could shape the future's memory. And in that sense, he got what he wanted. 2,000 years later, we still remember Nero not for ruling Rome, but for burning his name into history's stage.